What if I told you that right now, as you're watching this video, you're being remote controlled by dead economists, and you volunteered? That the very ideas you consider common sense, your opinions about success, happiness, even what makes a good person, have been carefully cultivated by forces you've never consciously noticed? Here's a disturbing example. Remember Cambridge Analytica? They didn't just steal data, they weaponized something Karl Marx predicted 150 years ago. By micro-targeting psychographic profiles, they convinced working-class voters in Rust Belt states that tax cuts for billionaires would restore their dignity. It worked because it tapped into a culturally encoded belief that real Americans side with the wealthy against elites. Marx laid the foundation for understanding this phenomenon, though the precise term false consciousness was later popularized by his collaborator Friedrich Engels. It's when we internalize beliefs that serve others' interests rather than our own, mistaking manufactured ideas for authentic thoughts. The Cambridge Analytica scandal wasn't just privacy violation, it was proof that this psychological control can override our material self-interest. This connects to groundbreaking research by Dr. John Jost at NYU on system justification theory. His experiments revealed that people living in unfair systems don't just tolerate inequality, they actively defend it, even when it works against their own interests. In one study, people from lower economic backgrounds were more likely to believe that economic inequality was justified and necessary than those from higher backgrounds. Marx predicted this exact phenomenon over 150 years ago. And today, neuroscience supports his insights about how our minds can be hegemonically influenced without our knowledge. But understanding this control is the first step to breaking free. So let me ask you, how many of your daily thoughts are truly your own? Karl Marx wrote, "The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class." Now, before you think this is going to be some political rant, understand that Marx wasn't just making a political statement. He was describing a psychological phenomenon that modern neuroscience has confirmed in disturbing detail. What Marx meant is simple. The people with power don't just control resources and institutions. They control something far more valuable, the way we think about reality itself. They shape what we consider normal, moral, and possible. But here's what makes this truly sophisticated. This isn't crude propaganda. It's the cultural encoding of ideas so subtle and complete that we mistake these manufactured concepts for our own authentic thoughts. Consider this curious fact. Why do we accept that some people work 3 jobs and still can't afford healthcare, while others inherit billions without lifting a finger? It's not because the system is natural or inevitable. It's because we've been systematically conditioned to see it as normal. Modern psychology backs this up with research on cultural cognition. Studies by Dan Kahan at Yale Law School show that people process information in ways that conform to the beliefs of their social groups, even when presented with contradictory evidence. Our brains literally filter reality to match the dominant narratives of our culture. We're not making independent judgments. We're unconsciously protecting the worldview we've inherited. But Marx's insight goes deeper than just big political ideas. He understood that capitalism doesn't just produce things. It produces relationships, identities, and desires. As he put it, capital is not only a sum of material products, it is above all a sum of social relations. In plain English, the economic system shapes who we think we are and what we think we want. This leads us to something fascinating. Dr. Tim Kazer's research at Knox College demonstrates this perfectly. His studies show that people who prioritize wealth and image over relationships and personal growth report higher levels of anxiety and depression. But here's the kicker. These materialistic values aren't natural human instincts. They're learned responses to a culture that profits from our insecurities. Kasser's experiments revealed that even brief exposure to materialistic messages measurably increased people's focus on wealth and status in subsequent tests. Marx called this commodity fetishism, the way we start to see human relationships through the lens of economic exchange. We begin to value ourselves and others based on what we can produce, consume, or accumulate. Consider how we talk about education today. It's rarely about learning or curiosity. Instead, we frame it as an investment in human capital that should yield a measurable return. We've turned the profound human experience of learning into a commodity transaction. The same pattern appears everywhere. Dating apps gamify romance, turning human connection into a marketplace where we swipe through potential partners like products. Social media transforms friendship into engagement metrics. Even our hobbies become side hustles that must generate income to be considered worthwhile. Can you think of an area of your life that hasn't been touched by this economic framing? Here's where Marx's psychological sophistication becomes truly remarkable. He wrote, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness." This sounds abstract, but it's actually describing a fundamental truth about human psychology that modern neuroscience supports. Your environment doesn't just influence your thoughts, it literally rewires your brain. A 2023 study had subjects read statements challenging their political beliefs. When conservatives heard taxing the rich funds innovation, or liberals heard border security protects workers, their amygdala, fear center, lit up like a grenade blast before their cortex could logically process it. This is Marx's social being determines consciousnesses in your synapses. Ideology isn't just ideas, it's neural pathways treating dissent as literal threat, but it gets deeper. Dr. Mauricio Delgado's research at Rutgers University uses brain imaging to study how social hierarchies affect neural processing. When participants believed they were lower in a social hierarchy, their brains showed decreased activity in regions associated with executive control and increased activity in areas linked to threat detection and stress response. Their neural architecture was being reshaped by their social position, making them more likely to accept authority and less likely to question existing arrangements. But here's the disturbing part. Many defended the very hierarchical system that was harming them. This connects to psychologist Melvin Lerner's research on the just world hypothesis. His experiments showed that people have a deep psychological need to believe that the world is fair. When confronted with evidence of injustice, instead of questioning the system, we often blame the victims or convince ourselves that inequality must be justified somehow. This isn't stupidity. It's our minds performing incredible mental gymnastics to maintain the illusion of justice because believing the world is fundamentally unfair is too threatening to our sense of security. Consider how hustle culture operates today. The idea that your worth is determined by your productivity and that rest is laziness has become so pervasive that people feel guilty for taking vacations. This isn't natural human behavior. Anthropological evidence, including Marshall Sahlins' influential work, suggests that hunter-gatherer societies typically worked 3 to 4 hours per day, though this remains debated among researchers. But we've been culturally encoded to see constant work as virtue. Marx would argue this conditioning serves the interests of those who profit from our labor, not our own well-being. This brings us to the digital age, where these psychological mechanisms have found their perfect laboratory. Marx couldn't have predicted the internet, but his theories about consciousness manipulation have found their perfect laboratory in the digital age. Social media platforms represent the most sophisticated form of false consciousness ever created, and they've made it addictive. Dr. Shoshana Zuboff's research on surveillance capitalism at Harvard describes how tech companies have moved beyond simply collecting data about what we do. They now use that data to influence what we'll do next. Every scroll, click, and pause is analyzed to create psychological profiles more detailed than we have of ourselves. These platforms then sell access to our attention to the highest bidder, who uses sophisticated behavioral psychology to influence our beliefs, desires, and actions. But here's what makes this especially insidious. The algorithm learns to give us content that confirms our existing biases while gradually shifting our views in profitable directions. A person concerned about their appearance might start seeing fitness content, which slowly morphs into diet culture, which eventually leads to expensive supplements and procedures. Someone interested in financial independence might be gradually guided toward cryptocurrency schemes or expensive business courses. Recent studies by Dr. Guillaume Chazlot, who formerly worked on YouTube's recommendation algorithm, revealed that the platform's AI was specifically designed to maximize watch time by gradually leading users toward more extreme content. Moderate political videos led to increasingly partisan content. Casual fitness videos led to extreme diet and exercise regimens. The algorithm had learned that emotional arousal, anger, fear, excitement kept people watching longer, so it systematically pushed users toward more extreme versions of whatever they were initially interested in. This represents Marx's concept of false consciousness operating at unprecedented scale and sophistication. Millions of people are being simultaneously influenced to believe that their algorithmically shaped desires represent their authentic selves. When was the last time you questioned whether your online interests actually came from you, or were subtly shaped by an algorithm designed to keep you scrolling? Marx made another observation that cuts to the heart of how we understand ourselves. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. In other words, our autonomy is more constrained than we realize. Our choices happen within a framework that was established before we were born, and that framework profoundly shapes what options we can even see as possible. When someone can't afford healthcare, we tell them to work harder, or make better choices. But what if the real problem isn't individual failure, but a system that makes basic human needs into luxury commodities? Dr. Sendil Mullainathan's research on scarcity provides psychological backing for this insight. His studies show that financial stress literally impairs cognitive function, making it harder for people to make good decisions. The stress of scarcity creates a psychological tunnel vision that makes it nearly impossible to think creatively about solutions. Think about how we frame unemployment. We talk about people finding jobs, as if jobs exist in nature waiting to be discovered, rather than acknowledging that employment depends on economic structures that could be organized differently. We've been taught to see unemployment as individual failure rather than systemic dysfunction. The same pattern appears everywhere. We blame individuals for climate change while ignoring that 100 companies produce 71% of global emissions. We tell people to vote with their wallets while ignoring that some wallets have billions of votes while others have none. It's worth noting that critics of Marx argue that his emphasis on economic determinism oversimplifies human agency, that people have more power to shape their circumstances than his theory suggests. This is a valid critique worth considering as we examine these patterns. But recognizing these constraints doesn't mean we're powerless, it means we need better tools for liberation. So how do we escape what Marx called the ruling ideas of the ruling class? His answer was surprisingly psychological. We need to become conscious of our own consciousness. That means examining the ideas we take for granted and asking whose interests they actually serve. This ties into modern research on metacognition, or thinking about thinking. Studies by Dr. Janet Metcalf at Columbia University show that people with higher metacognitive awareness tend to make better decisions and are far less vulnerable to manipulation. Why? Because they can step outside their immediate thoughts and look at them objectively. Here's one way to do that. For 1 week, every time you feel a strong urge, whether it's to buy something, chase a goal, or even defend an opinion, pause Ask yourself, where did this desire come from? Who benefits if I act on it? Keep a quick log of your answers. You might be shocked at how often your so-called spontaneous wants trace back to a recent ad, a social media post, or a cultural script you absorbed without even noticing. Another practice is what I call a common sense audit. Write down 5 things you believe are obviously true about success, human nature, or how the world works. Then question them. When did you start believing these things? What did people believe before these ideas became common sense? For example, the notion that hard work always leads to success didn't become dominant until the Protestant work ethic collided with the rise of industrial capitalism. You can also try a kind of media archaeology. Once a week, make time to deliberately consume media that challenges your usual perspective. Not to blindly agree, but to notice how unfamiliar ideas can reveal the invisible scaffolding holding up your current worldview. And start paying attention to the internal voices that guide your daily choices. When you feel guilty for resting, whose voice is telling you that productivity equals worth? When you feel inadequate scrolling through social media, whose standards are shaping your definition of success? Often, these voices aren't even ours. They're internalized messages from parents, culture, advertising that we've mistaken for personal truth. And this isn't just about individual awakening. Marx believed that real liberation happens collectively. When people start sharing their experiences and questioning their assumptions together, they often realize that what felt like personal failure was actually a symptom of a broken system. This brings us to some powerful examples of collective consciousness raising in action. History shows us powerful examples of communities that have successfully resisted ideological control. Indigenous communities worldwide maintain economic systems based on reciprocity rather than accumulation. Worker cooperatives like Mondragon in Spain demonstrate alternatives to hierarchical workplace relationships. The universal healthcare movements in multiple countries have successfully reframed health as a fundamental right, rather than a commodity. A powerful recent example of consciousness raising in action. The fight for 15 minimum wage campaign succeeded not just through traditional organizing, but by reframing the entire conversation. Instead of accepting that some jobs are entry-level and naturally low-paid, organizers helped people recognize that calling jobs entry-level was ideological. It justified poverty wages by suggesting workers would naturally progress to better positions, when data showed most remained trapped in low-wage work. By shifting the conversation from entry-level jobs to survival wages, they exposed how language itself had been shaped to serve corporate interests. What these movements share is what Marx called critical consciousness, the collective recognition that current arrangements aren't natural laws but human choices that can be changed. The most effective resistance to false consciousness happens when communities create spaces for honest dialogue about their shared reality. Book clubs, discussion groups, even informal conversations where people feel safe to question common sense. These become laboratories for authentic thinking. Some might ask, isn't some common sense actually functional? How do we avoid replacing one ideology with another? The key distinction is between wisdom, that serves human flourishing, versus beliefs that primarily serve power structures. We're not seeking to replace one rigid ideology with another. We're developing the capacity to think critically about all ideologies, including our own. What gives me hope is that today's most inspiring movements are already applying Marx's insights about consciousness, often without naming them explicitly. The push for universal basic income challenges the deep-seated belief that a person's worth depends on their productivity. Environmental justice campaigns are forcing us to confront the illusion that endless economic growth is natural or necessary. Mental health advocates are reframing depression and anxiety not as personal failures, but as rational responses to deeply unhealthy systems. Each of these movements begins with the same powerful realization. that what we often call human nature is really just current culture, and culture can be changed. But changing consciousness at scale requires understanding how ideas spread. Research by Dr. Damon Centola at the University of Pennsylvania shows that social change happens not when a few highly connected people adopt new ideas, but when clusters of people in tight-knit communities begin adopting them simultaneously. This suggests that consciousness liberation spreads through deep conversation in small groups rather than viral messaging to large audiences. This aligns perfectly with Marx's insight that authentic change comes from collective reflection rather than individual enlightenment. When people gather to honestly examine their shared conditions, whether in union halls, community centers, or informal friend groups, they create the social conditions necessary for new ways of thinking to emerge. The most successful consciousness-raising efforts combine personal reflection with collective action. People need space to examine their individual experiences, but they also need community to understand how those experiences connect to larger patterns and possibilities. This isn't abstract theory. You've seen how internalized voices, common sense assumptions, and hidden ideologies shape how we live and think. But once exposed, they lose their grip. Once questioned, they can be rewritten. So here's your challenge. Rebel in small ways. When guilt creeps in for resting, remind yourself, your worth isn't your output. When you hear a voice in your head shaming you or pushing you toward consumption, ask, whose voice is this really? When something feels obviously true, stop and wonder, says who? And most importantly, don't do this alone. Consciousness liberation happens faster when it happens together. Find a friend, a group, a comment thread, and ask the big questions. Which beliefs do we want to keep? Which were planted in us for someone else's benefit? What's one obvious truth about success or human nature that you've never questioned? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. This is how resistance begins, not with slogans, but with clarity, not with rage, but with reflection, not by tearing down the world overnight, but by seeing through the illusions that hold it up. Once we recognize the strings, we can cut them. Once we question the obvious, we can choose what's actually worth believing. Thanks for thinking alongside me. If this sparked something in you, consider sharing it. Not just the video, but the questions, the doubts, the conversations. Because the more minds we free, the more possible it becomes to build a world worth living in. This was Philosophy Coded. And tonight, when you're scrolling, pause and ask yourself, is this my desire or just an algorithm's profit plan? That question alone is a quiet act of rebellion